Welcome to episode 198 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about a record which is reputed to be the first record in the whole history of bossa nova. And that is this one, Canção Do Amor Demais by Elizete Cardoso, Brazilian singer. Came out in 1958 on Festive Records. There were only 2,000 copies, and this is actually one of them. This is an original 1958 Brazilian pressing. In terms of background, there are really two parts to this story, the singer and the music. The singer, Elizete Cardoso, was born in July 1920 in Rio de Janeiro. She was discovered by the Brazilian composer Jacob de Bandolim on her 16th birthday. In 1950, she releases Canção Do Amor, or Song of Love. This becomes a big hit. She starts to appear on TV. She begins to release singles on a regular basis. She also starts a burgeoning movie career. So by the early 1950s, she has become a very big star in Brazil. She's on the radio, she's on the TV, she's on movie screens. All of her records up until 1955 were singles on 10-inch shellac 78s. In 1955, however, she releases her first long player, Canções à Meia Luz, or Songs to the Half Light. This sells well, and it accelerates what was already a prolific recording career. For the next 25 years, she basically puts out 2 albums a year. I think she's got something like 51 in total. Now to the music, and the music, of course, is written by Antonio Carlos Jobim, or Tom Jobim, and Vinicius de Moraes. I've talked about Jobim's background in numerous reviews, so this time I'm going to concentrate on Vinicius. He was born in Gavia, which is a suburb of Rio, in 1913 to quite wealthy parents and well-read parents who named him after a character in a novel. He grew up in Botafogo, spending a lot of time with his grandfather, and he eventually studies law at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. There he fell in with a group of right-wing Catholics, which you have to think is never a good idea, led by a guy called Otávio de Faria. Vinicius at this point was still heavily enthralled to the church. He was fascinated with right-wing ideas, and his writing and his poetry at this point is still very conservative and very sort of arch-Catholic in its nature. It's all about resisting temptation and purity and lots of almost kind of borderline fascist ideas. Complicating all this is the fact that Faria, who was gay, had fallen in love with Vinicius, who was a magnetic guy all the way through his life, was not reciprocated because Vinicius was not gay. That wasn't going to work, and Faria is distraught and attempts suicide, and the two of them end up estranged. In 1938, he wins a fellowship to Oxford. He goes there for a couple of years, but then in 1941, he's got to come back because, of course, the war has started. He works as a film critic for a while. He writes the Foreign Service exam, doesn't pan out. Then he has an experience which ends up being kind of formative. Through connections, he meets an American writer, a guy called Waldo Frank, who's come to Brazil and wants to go to the northern part of the country. And on that trip, he sees the reality of exploitation. He sees the reality of poverty. His eyes are open to all this, and he swings from one part of the political spectrum right over to the other, where he remained for the rest of his life. This experience under his belt, in 1943, he writes the Foreign Service exam again, and he passes his time. As a diplomat, he spends time in Los Angeles, he spends time in Paris, but also, and I guess this is the life of somebody with a fair amount of privilege who becomes a diplomat in the 1950s, he had lots of time to write books of poetry, to write plays, to write song lyrics, to write film reviews, and basically to build up a fairly large portfolio of artistic work when he wasn't, I guess, having cocktails. Back in Brazil in the mid-1950s, he has his play called Orfeu de Conceição, which he wants to turn into a musical. And at a bar in 1956, he meets a young composer, a guy called Tom Jobim, and persuades him to write the score, and he's going to write the libretto, and this is going to be the musical Orfeu de Conceição. It's first performed in Rio in 1956, and it's a massive event. It's the first time at the National Theatre that an all-black cast has put on a production. It would also soon be made into a film, which would win the Cannes Film Festival, would also win the Oscar for Best Foreign Film in 1959. But Vinicius and Tom had really struck a chord and were doing lots of writing together above and beyond this particular soundtrack, and that is where Elizete Cardoso comes into the story again. So Festa Records was owned by a guy called Irineo Garcia, who was a journalist. Festa was basically known not actually for producing musical discs, but for actually making recordings of spoken poetry. The plan was hatched for Festa Records to put out a whole album of songs by Vinicius and Tom. Vinicius knew that neither his voice nor Tom's voice was strong enough to carry a whole long-playing record, so they had to find someone to notch up, and his idea was Elizete Cardoso. But she wasn't Garcia's first choice, and she wasn't Tom Jobim's first choice either. They both wanted a woman called Dolores Duran, somebody that Jobim had known for years, who was much more familiar with the clubs and the bossa nova scene in Rio, and probably might have been a better fit for this record. However, she wanted a huge fee. Garcia couldn't pay it, so then they asked Cardoso, and she asked for a fee which they could afford, and so the deal was made. The record's made at Columbia Studios in Rio in April 1958 with Garcia producing. Gilberto, of course, plays on here on guitar. He's not credited, of course. In fact, on the liner notes, which are handwritten by Vinicius and are very poetic, nobody other than Tom Jobim and Elizete and Vinicius himself are mentioned. He was supposed to play on 5 tracks. He only ends up playing on 2, and that's a bit of an issue for this record, and it stems in large measure from clashes between Gilberto and Elizete. He keeps trying to impress on her, relax, don't sing these songs like hymnals or sacred pieces, sing like a bossa nova singer, get into the groove of it and get into the rhythm of it. And she, was basically talk to the hand. Listen, I've been cutting records for a long time, singing on the radio for a long time. I don't need advice from you. When the record's eventually produced, there were only 2,000 copies pressed, as I mentioned, and this is only partly due to economic caution on the part of Garcia. He was a journalist. Vinicius was a poet, and both of them were a little bit concerned about associating their serious reputations and professional personae with a pop record. Since then, however, this record has been re-released quite a few times, primarily because its historical significance has begun to be appreciated. And before I talk about the music, a word about the somewhat eccentric cover art, which shows Elizete in front of a bunch of very serious-looking tomes in this bookcase, at least one of which I have been able to figure out is a collection of Dadaist cartoons from the Weimar Republic. Side one starts with Chega de Saudade, which is one of only 2 actual bossa nova tunes on this record by my count. I think Cardoso's singing here is actually pretty close to the mark. There's other places in this record where some of her formal mannerisms are a little bit much, but I think the bigger issue here is the arrangement, and this is where Jobim is actually letting down the side, because that song has such a wonderful, timeless melody, and so often they actually move off the melody to all kinds of other flourishes. Serenata do Adeus is next. This is definitely not bossa. If it's not opera, and it's not opera, it's certainly very theatrical, and it is definitely the kind of pop music that you would associate more with the first half of the 20th century than the second half. As Praias Desertas is actually a lovely lyric. It's about deserted beaches waiting for lovers to reemerge and reunite. Caminho de Pedra, or Cobblestone Street, is a beautiful performance by Cardoso. Not really a bossa tune, but a really, really lovely tune. Luciana is next, and lyrically this is 100% bossa nova, even if musically it really isn't. The final track on side 1, Janelas Abertas, is similar. It's very, very beautiful, just like the previous track, but like so much of the beautiful work on this, it is much more conservative and much more traditionally delivered than what is to come from a lot of these artists, not the singer, but from her accompanists and from the songwriters. The standout track on side 2 is Outra Vez, which is the other out-and-out bossa nova track, typically bossa nova, and then it's got a perky, upbeat musical sound and rhythm, but a very sad theme. It was always that contrast that makes bossa nova work so well. What stands out here, and her delivery technically is lovely, but what she does is use a lot of vibrato, and if you listen to all the better-known bossa nova singers, you don't hear vibrato. You hear an absence of it. It's delivered in such a way to be plain and conversational and simple, and that was kind of the idea. Elizete is coming in with this Rolls Royce of a voice into kind of a backyard cookout of a song, and somehow that combination doesn't entirely work. And that pathology kind of infects a lot of the other tracks on side 2, including the title track. You've got these sad bossa themes. Without the upbeat and contrasting bossa rhythm, you don't really have the magic. I would, however, single out Vida Bella, which is musically upbeat and a really thrilling arrangement with strings and cowbell, of all things. And the other song I'd single out is Estrada Branca, which is a beautiful performance by Cardoso. And it's also got Vinicius, once again, throwing his emotions onto the bonfire of unrequited love. This is a bit of a weird record because the individual performances, all excellent, but there is no clear vision and clearly no agreement between the musicians as to what these songs are supposed to sound like. With a singer who knew the bossa scene better, and maybe it would have been better to have had Dolores Duran, this could have been a very different record. Instead, we have a singer who, for the day, is laying down a whole bunch of straight-ahead pop, lots of vibrato, lots of formal touches, and seems a little bit unsure who she's working with. Gilberto in particular is kind of wasted here, and of course he's going to blow the whole thing out of the water a few months later with his debut. It is the first LP with true bossa nova songs on it, but it's too confused about its identity for it to truly be the first bossa nova LP. The songs are good, she's a great singer, but it's not worth more than 3.5 out of 5 stars.